what happened with Zionism is racism, Zionism is racism. The resolution came from nowhere in 1975, and since then a huge fight has been led by many people, of which Dr. Manor was one of the pillars, to get the resolution abandoned, which, as far as I understand, has never before happened at the General Assembly resolution. Took 16 years, and now Zionism is racism is rife again. So I thought it was a very, very good idea to have Dr. Manor explain this here. It's, by the way, written up in an extremely interesting book he wrote 16 years ago, to right along. The last copies at all available for those who are interested, here available at the bargain price of 50 shekel. That's the whole stock which remains of this book, which also appeared in here, as far as I recall. It's very interesting that 25 years ago, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, Israel has little to fear from the strictly military balance, but I believe that Israel has much to fear from the ideological assault aimed at branding Israel as illegitimate. So the delegitimization, Moynihan saw 25 years ago, a thing which the Israeli government has already discovered last year. Took them really 25 years to understand that the battle against the delegitimization of Israel was something which should be put high on the agenda, which shows you that in another way that ideas don't die. Before I introduce Dr. Manor, our last lecture before the Pesach holidays will be by Professor Jonathan Sarna. Doesn't need much introduction, I guess, the leading historian of American Jewry. He'll speak about American Jewish journalism, past, present, and future, because that's obviously a subject which is drastically going to change in the coming decades. On the one hand, American Jewish journalism has played a major role in the issue of informing the Jewish community, providing it with information as a tool for developing American Jewry. On the other hand, with the coming up of the internet, the decline of the written media, this is perhaps one of the fields in the activities of American Jewry which will undergo the most radical change in the coming decade. Dr. Manor has been very often at the center, has already spoken here once. He was born in Paris in 1937, he came to Israel in 1957, he's a graduate of the Ecole Nationale Administration, the ENA, which is as close to God as you can get it in secular France. His Ph.D. is on Palestine in the foreign policy of Gamal El-Nasser. He was a lecturer at the Hebrew University in political sciences between 1970 and 1978. He then, for 6 years, was the Director General of the Information Department of the World Zionist Organization, during which years he was very active in this battle. And he's now the chairman of Impact SE, which surveys school curricula, and you have certainly heard about the many analyses they have published of textbooks, not only of the Palestinians, but also of other Arab countries, and as far as I understand, the last one was Tunisia. So, Yohanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manfred. You just say that this resolution against Zionism came from nowhere. Well, actually, it was not so from nowhere. At its very beginning, the idea of having Zionism condemned by the UN came from the Soviet Union, before the Six Day War. It stemmed from the refusal of the Soviet Union to condemn anti-Semitism.
to condemn anti-Semitism. Since the Soviets were not, it was not a proper position to voice their opposition to condemning anti-Semitism, so they conditioned their acceptance to condemn anti-Semitism by their demand to condemn Zionism as being a form of racism. Now, this occurred during the negotiation of the UN Convention Against Racism. After the Six-Day War, as a consequence of the severe blow inflicted to its weaponry and prestige, the Soviet Union developed a more militant policy to regain and enlarge its influence in this region. This policy was based on a quasi-total backing of the PLO in the expectation that it will bring both the Arab state and the Arab state on their side. This scheme went well and enabled the Soviet Union to get strongholds in the Middle East, notably in Syria and Egypt, which were on the verge of becoming Soviet colonies. I stress, Soviet colonies. The expulsion of the Soviet advisor from Egypt, the Israel-Egypt disengagement negotiation, the Israel-Syria disengagement agreement with the active involvement of the US led to a PLO Soviet plan to bring about the expulsion of Israel from the UN, with the PLO taking its place. On November 22, 1974, the PLO got the status of observer as a national liberation movement. And in August 1975, the Organization of African Unity evoked explicitly, I quote, depriving Israel of its status as member. And at the UN National General Assembly on October 1, Idi Amin, representing the Arab group, called for, I quote, the expulsion of Israel from the UN and the extinction of Israel as a state so that the territorial integrity of Palestine may be ensured. In parallel, the Soviet Union and the PLO pushed forward an initiative to bring about a condemnation of Zionism. This occurred for the first time, Zionism was associated with racism in a resolution of the United General Assembly regarding apartheid. And in July 1975, they succeed to have it explicitly condemned, not only associated, but explicitly condemned, at the first UN International Women's Year in Mexico. So, this is the resolution. You see? Together with Zionism. So, peace depends on the elimination of Zionism. Not only, but notably. Then, in August 75, at the Organization of Arab Unity Conference in Kampala and at the Non-Aligned Conference in Lima, also in August 75, it was also stressed almost in the same words. Now, Western and above all American strong opposition to Israel expulsion or suspension from the UN, notably USA warning that such a move will force the US to reassess its membership, thwarted this initiative. But at the same time, it increased tenfold the eagerness to push forward a substitute for it, namely the condemnation of Zionism as racism. This was achieved first within the framework of the Third Committee on October 16, 1975, and then by the plenary on November 10, 1975. The Soviet-Arab coalition won by 72 to 35 votes with 2 abstentions. This is the resolution, and what is important in the end, which we have this was the bottom line of the resolution, determines that Zionism is a form of racism. Now, the vote was followed by an explosion of joy. Hadassah Benito was a member of the Israeli delegation at this meeting, has described in detail how this joy expressed itself. It was really, you could feel the hatredness and the joy about having had success. But actually, this victory was far from resounding and fell short of the more than 100 votes that this Arab-Soviet coalition was used to receive at the UN. Now, we should recall also that there were two attempts, procedural attempts, to postpone the debate and the vote, but they were rejected. The first one was by Sierra Leone. It was rejected by 68 to 45 votes. And also in the plenary by a Belgian motion, which was rejected by 67 to 55, with 15 abstentions. Now, it's likely that the resolute and coordinated effort by the US, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, and countries from Latin America and Africa could have mustered the additional vote for securing a postponement. But this did not occur. Probably, on one hand, out of the feeling of relief that the most ominous threat, the expulsion of Israel from the UN, had been foiled, and on the other, out of the inner conviction that this far-fetched, aberrant, and shameful resolution from Shmum will actually have no palatable weight, and that the UN will do its best to forget it. Well, how it was overturned? Except for Eleanor Holmes Norton, a woman involved in the lobbying for women's rights, an American one. Only days after the adoption of the ZR, she announced that an international committee of women had been set up to annul, to overturn 3379. 3379 is the number of this resolution, and sometimes it's shortened, it's easier to mention it in this way. Well, actually, except for this statement, for her statement, there was rather no Israeli or Jewish attempt to act for its overturning. But exactly the opposite, namely disregard and disdain. For instance, soon after the adoption, Rabbi Miller, I think it was at this time heading the conference for the conference of the President Conference in the US, was told by the Israeli embassy, I quote, to ignore the whole issue since it was nonsense. Well, Israel expected that this nonsense will go away by itself, and that disregard will achieve this. This position, which was to last for almost a decade, was sheer nonsense. Between 1976 and 1984, the ZR was reiterated time and again, sometimes even by larger majorities. Here you have, no, this is not that. Yeah, after that. This was the pattern. Okay, this is what all the resolutions, not all, most of the resolutions are adopted between 1976, at which issue and by which majority, 1984. Okay. What is also important to stress, in 1980, at the UN Mid-Decade International Women's Conference in Copenhagen, the struggle to eliminate Zionism was for the first time included in an operative document, not only in the declaration, namely in the program of action for the second half of the UN Decade for Women. This meant that the administrative units of the Secretary General of the UN, notably the Office for Public Information, would have to include the condemnation of Zionism in their activities. Now, since the adoption of the ZR, Zionism was taking a mythical proportion in international discourse as a global cause of most world problems. And this trend was not confined to the Arab, Muslim, or Islamic countries and to the Third World, but it penetrated deeply within Western circles, especially in university and campuses. For instance, in Britain, in 1976 and in 1977, student unions adopted the resolution, by the way, in sheer contradiction with their previous policy not to deal with the Middle East. And subsequently, several student unions, such as those at York University, at Salford University, they decide on the basis of this resolution to strike Jewish societies, Jewish student societies, from their registers and to restrict their activities. Did you hear that? Okay. In the state, in 1983, at the State University of New York, Ernest Dube, a professor in African studies, includes Zionism in a course on the politics of race as one of the three forms of racism, the two others being apartheid and Nazism. One of the research subjects that he gave, or he proposed to his students, was Zionism is as much racism as Nazism. And in his defense, he evoked Resolution 3379. The vilification of Zionism during this period turned into a permanent feature of international life. Zionism became a metaphor for universal evil, becoming part of the common knowledge, accepted or at least not contradicted by almost the whole international body politic. The DHAR, the Zionist racism formula, was having a very powerful impact, which was not anticipated when the 3379 was adopted. And it came not instead of, but in addition to, the consequences that were foreseen, placing Israel beyond the pale and giving anti-Semitism international sanction. Now, before the ZR, in the year 1969 to 72, there were 4 anti-Israeli resolutions per year at the UN. 4. Afterwards, between 73 and 78, this number raised to 16 per year. And it reached a peak in 1982 with 44 anti-Israeli resolutions at the UN. 44. Now, the vilification of Zionism was not merely a substitute strategy instead of expelling Israel from the UN. In a sense, it was even worse. Israel's formal membership in the UN was indeed maintained. But at the same time, it was increasingly deprived from its basic rights as a member state. Professor Jean Kirkpatrick, at the time US ambassador to the UN, explained how it worked, namely, I quote, denying membership by denying participation, instilling the illegitimacy of Israel by placing it in a state of growing irrelevancy. This phenomenon was analyzed in detail by Professor Ehud Sprinzak, who worked with me for a long time on this issue, and he explains what is the meaning of losing its legitimacy, becoming irrelevant, not even being able to propose anything. But this is not exactly the subject of this lecture. In any case, the huge and mounting damage inflicted by 3379 was not considered by official Israel as sufficient to fight openly and directly the ZR and to act to overturn it. 2 arguments were often mentioned by Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Oh, this is it. It's coming. To justify Israel's inertia in this respect. First, that initiating action will be counterproductive, since the automatic majority, or the so-called automatic majority, at the disposal of the Soviet Union and the Arab and Muslim states, would result in reiterations. And second, that it was formally impossible to overturn a UNGA resolution, and that there was not such a precedent. Yet, reiteration was already on its way from the very beginning. And Resolution 379 was a legal and political foundation for turning the Jewish state into an illegitimate one. It was now crystal clear that the UN ZR resolution was to be fought in itself, directly, not only as one of the expression of anti-Semitism. The question now was how. Of course, the central body was to steer this fight. And it took the form of a steering committee against the ZR, set up by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the WZO. A no less crucial issue was to conceive a strategy with a chance of getting results, in spite of the so-called, again, I stress, so-called automatic majority. Namely, by at least preventing reiteration, and more essentially, by undermining the validity and legitimacy of this ZR resolution, of the ZR resolution. A first success was achieved in neutralizing a Kuwaiti initiative seeking to get a reiteration of the ZR by the Inter-Parliamentary Union in its annual session in September 1984 in Geneva. This was achieved through a mobilization of both the Israeli political parties and the Jewish community worldwide to use their link with political parties of the delegates to the International Parliamentary Union in order to prevent or defeat the Kuwait initiative. And it worked. They were not able to pass it. The real change was not to find ways, was not only to prevent reiteration, was important of course, but the real change was to find ways to undermine the validity and legitimacy of the ZR, and to strip it from any moral and political value. This was achieved mainly through a long series of international, national, and regional conferences, first in Israel, then in America, in Europe, and in Latin America. Also, by an international petition to the UN, signed by more than 1,000 personalities from all over the world, calling upon it, upon the UN, to disavow the abusive resolution and to rededicate itself to its founding charter. And finally, by a series of parliamentary resolutions worded in the same spirit. The first such resolution was the Sense of the Congress resolution adopted in July 1985 by the US Senate, repudiating the ZR, the 3379, and calling the parliament of all countries which value freedom and democracy to do the same. This draft resolution was decisive in preventing the reiteration of the ZR at the Nairobi conference closing the UN Decade for Women. Ambassador Ellen Keyes, then the chief advisor to the US delegation, included reference of it in its statement and got clear instruction from Washington that Zionism was not to be included in any paragraph of the final document to be adopted by conference. And if this occurred, the US delegate had to leave. All this demonstrated that fighting directly the ZR could prevent its reiteration, and that its abrogation was not mission impossible, but rather an attainable goal, albeit this is a very, very difficult one to achieve. In Israel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, this time it was Yehuda Milo, was in charge of this issue, began to count the votes. But there was still a very, very long way to go. At the initiative of the chairman of the Zionist Federation of Australia, Mark Liebler, the Australian government was convinced by him to table before the Australian Parliament a resolution proclaiming it was not a parliamentary initiative, it was coming from the government. A resolution proclaiming that 3379 was inconsistent with the goals of the UN and recommending that the government of Australia lend support to efforts to overturn Resolution 3379. Moreover, the Australian government itself involved itself and checked what will be the position of each of the Asian countries with such a revocation or a draft to revoke 3379. Actually, at this time, the result was extremely disappointing. Almost no country changed its position in Asia. Only a few other parliamentary resolutions were passed. First, there was another resolution in the United States. exactly according to the same line as the Australian resolution. And afterwards, in Peru, in the European Parliament, and in Uruguay. And their wording was far less committing than the Australian or the American ones. Most of the democratic countries were dragging their feet. 5 years will still be necessary to overturn 379. The repeal was finally achieved not thanks to the end of the Cold War, as many pretend, according to my dear colleague, Professor Shlomo Avineri. That was full completely. But first and foremost, thanks to the direct involvement of the USA in taking the lead in this endeavor. This active involvement was not the result, was the result first and foremost of the unabated pressure exerted on the US Congress and exerted by the US Congress and by American Jewish Organization on the administration. Hence, the US administration put this issue very high on its agenda, even higher than it was on Israel's agenda. In his address to AIPAC on May 14, 1989, James Baker called on the Arab countries to take measure to spur the peace process forward, suggesting, in addition to ending their economic boycott against Israel, also a retreat, I quote, from the odious ZR. So he put the onus on the Arab states to take steps signaling that they were serious about the peace process. But on the other hand, he made a linkage between the peace process and the repeal of the 379. By contrast, Vice President Dan Quayle at Yeshiva University on International Human Rights Day on December 1989 did not need the repeal to the peace process, but to the renewal of the UN, referring to the historic resolution co-sponsored by the US and the USSR, calling on all members of the UN to respect the principles set forth in the UN Charter. Quayle made a resounding suggestion, I quote, "I call on the Soviet Union and other nations to join us in co-sponsoring a second resolution in the GA. That resolution will affirm that Zionism is what Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko rightly called back in 1948, namely the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. This resolution will state that Zionism is not and never has been a former regime, and would have the ZR declared null and void. And this resolution will promote and not set back the prospect for peace by focusing on the real issue and not on Israel's right to exist." End of the quote. The official reaction of the USSR was extremely disappointing. The Soviet government still was clinging to its traditional anti-Zionist stand. What was more surprising was a lukewarm response from many Western democratic countries, which held the view that, I quote, "the repeal was impossible without a breakthrough in the Middle East process." Actually, none of these European Western countries, except the US and Australia, did anything in order to act in the direction of repeal. Well, it was not a bright expectation. Now, at a public hearing chaired by Senator Moynihan on March 13, 1990, John Bolton, representing the State Department, gave an optimistic assessment of the prospect of an overturn. Moynihan was infuriated by Bolton's apparent self-satisfaction and criticized the State Department for its lack of energy in fighting the resolution, saying that it wanted to see more action against it. Now I want to quote quite lengthily Moynihan and Bolton. He went on saying, I quote, "The West imposed no consequences of any kind on those nations that associated themselves with the filthy proposition of the Soviet Union. I want to see the US cut assistance to countries which supported the resolution. How many of them receive and are still receiving US aid?" Bolton replied that of the 72 which voted in favor of the resolution, a clear majority at that point received US aid, and probably still did. Moynihan then asked him, did we ever tell one country, just one country, that you are getting American money and you are not getting it anymore until you change your mind? On the defenses, Bolton answered, I don't know that any country has ever been told that. Senator, but I could leave one message with the committee here today. It is that the Bush administration is more serious about having this resolution repealed. But again, he said, I don't know that any country ever has been told that. Now, the joint resolution on which Moynihan was working, in Joint Resolution 246, was not only adopted by the Senate and the House, but officially endorsed by President Bush. This is a text of it. But what is interesting in this endorsement is that President Bush still found it appropriate to add a paragraph on the US commitment to promote peace. In other words, not really a linkage, but still some kind of hint that it's a part of it should be a part of the process. As a result, it had immediate result. As a result, several days after Bush endorsement, the Troika, heading at this time the EU, took a commitment to act for the repeal of the TR. So the first time that there was a clear position by the European institutions. Now, in mid-August, the count was 60 against 60 with 40 abstention. Now, in view of this figure, in mid-September, we decided to postpone the repeal initiative. The US press claimed that it was an American decision in order not to jeopardize every support for sanctions against Iraq. Yohanan Manor, from the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, claimed that he was in charge of this issue at the ministry, claimed that it was an Israeli decision based on the evaluation of what the backing will be. In any case, it was postponed. A year later, during the summer of 1998 and 1991, there was once again indication that some were looking for, again, a postponement. A first indication came from James Wall, the private secretary of John Major, and then from Gareth Evans, the Australian Minister of Trade and Foreign Affairs, since they considered that was not yet a majority. But the biggest blow came from the United States, because they feared that a motion to defer would easily be passed in the United Nations General Assembly, especially on the initiative of Egypt. So, what we have to understand here, that the inclination to postpone again reflected probably a genuine concern regarding the success for the repeal. But it also reflected tension between Israel and the United States over what will be the desirable framework of a Middle East peace conference. In June 1991, Shamir expressed Israel's strong reservation about the participation of the UN in a such conference, given the UN treatment of Israel by the UN over the years, and mentioning among many other one-sided positions of the UN, Resolution 379. It was not the only one, but he mentioned that among many other one-sided positions. In any case, Shamir never mentioned or invoked the repeal as a condition for accepting the involvement of the UN in such a peace conference. Of course, he was not ready to pay a political price for that. On September 23, at the 1991, at the opening of the United Nations General Assembly, Bush raised the issue of 379, but this time without linking it to any other issue in itself. From this time, from then on, there was a massive US investment in the repeal endeavor. And no doubt that arm twisting was used in the spirit of Moynihan exhortations. President Bush gave very clear instruction to all his ambassadors, warning countries that failure to vote for revoking the resolution could affect their tie with the US. Finally, the repeal was sponsored, or the repeal draft resolution was sponsored by 86 states and passed by 111 against 25 with 13 abstentions. Now, unfortunately, the ZR revocation was not exploited by Israel and by its supporters, with perhaps the sole tardily exception of initiating a research on the overturn of 379 that was to become this book. And of course, what we did with this book was not only to write it, but to send it to 1,200 universities, mostly in the United States, to their libraries. It was very marginal move. To my knowledge, it was the only, perhaps with another exception that I refer to, perhaps not in my paper presentation, but perhaps in the discussion. Now, what's going on today? Do we witness a resurgence of the ZR? Now, since the overturn of 379, more than 18 years ago, we have witnessed two opposite trends. On the one hand, the strengthening of Israel's legitimacy. The strengthening of Israel's legitimacy. And on the other hand, ongoing attempts to undermine it. On the positive side, there has been a steady and ongoing strengthening of Israel's position and standing on the international scene, notably at the UN, where it has ceased to be a pariah state, and in which it has regained full membership in taking part fully in all the activity of the UN, at all levels, and in all its specialized agencies. A complete departure, this is a complete departure from James Kirkpatrick diagnosis, denying membership by denying participation. Moreover, in 2005, the General Assembly supported unanimously the establishment of an annual Holocaust Remembrance Day. And a UN Holocaust education program was also created at the same time. Next, in January 2007, 2 years afterward, the GA adopted a resolution condemning any denial of the Holocaust, stressing that such a denial was, I quote, tantamount to approval of genocide in all its forms. Now, there was far less progress regarding the condemnation of anti-Semitism. Soon after the repeal, for the first time in the history of the UN, anti-Semitism was condemned by a UN body. Actually, by the 55 members of the UN Human Rights Commission. Actually, it was the Human Rights Commission, yes. I quoted. This body adopted in March 1994 the following text. Namely, measure to combat, it was a text concerning measures to combat contemporary form of racism, and it was sponsored by Turkey with the support of Canada, Holland, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the UK, Romania, and Russia. And it referred explicitly to the anti-Semitism in its introduction and also in its operative paragraph. Yes, I think this is it. Now, in December 2003, a draft resolution condemning anti-Semitism was withdrawn in the face of Arab and Muslim opposition, contrary to a deal by which Israel will drop efforts to include anti-Semitism in a draft resolution of religious intolerance in exchange for Ireland commitment. Ireland was the main country in charge of preparing this draft resolution, to introduce a new resolution specifically on anti-Semitism and focusing on anti-Semitism. So it was foiled by the Arab and Muslim opposition. And the deal, it was a time of Sylvain Shalom, and the deal was actually turned into a mockery. In compensation, on June 2004, a seminar on anti-Semitism, sponsored by the UN, was held at the UN in New York. It was not easy. Most of the Arab and Muslim countries opposed that the UN give a room and sponsor such a seminar, but it took place. And again, a year later, in August 2004, there was again the same proposal that was to be submitted to the United General Assembly. And again, because of Arab opposition, this draft resolution on anti-Semitism was not able to present it. So, in addition to this persistent reluctance to condemn explicitly and openly anti-Semitism, there has been a series of one-sided and biased resolutions against Israel at UN. For instance, the advisory opinion given by the International Court of Justice, that I quote, "The construction of a wall in occupied Palestine territories and its associated regime are contrary to international law," or by the 2 UN World Conference Against Racism, Durban 1 in 2001, Durban 2 in April 2009, or the resolution adopted since its creation in 2006 by the UN Human Rights Council, not Commission, but Council, which was designed to replace the discredited UN Commission on Human Rights. Now, all this is correct, but we should not mix everything together. First of all, regarding the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, Israel could probably have gotten a more objective and balanced one if it had cooperated, in my opinion, with the Hague Court and used the position taken by the Israel High Court of Justice on this issue. It was a very strong position. It was a very good card for Israel to use, but this was not the case for different reasons. Regarding Durban 1, much of the hatred against Jews and Israel took place in the 6-day NGO forum attended by 6,000 representatives of around 2,000 NGOs, where the attacks on Jews were no less virulent than the attacks on globalization. As to the official conference, it expressed in its final report its concern about, as usual, the plight of the Palestinian people and recognized the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the assertion of an independent state. Okay. But, as well, it recognized the right, I quote, to security for all the states in the region, including Israel. European countries and a few other blunted the more extreme anti-Israeli language introduced by Iran and the Arab countries, but at the end they agreed to single out Israel in a more moderate and balanced language, but they single out Israel. Now, we should not forget, nevertheless, that we should ignore that all the states in the same declaration called upon, I quote, called upon all the states to counter anti-Semitism and never to forget the Holocaust. This was also in the declaration of Durban 1. Now, regarding Durban 2, in spite of the High Commissioner for Human Rights statement that it was a week before the conference itself, in Geneva, I quote, "All disputed points, such as reference to Israel, Zionism, and the Middle East, had been deleted from the declaration." In spite of her declaration, 9 countries decided to boycott the conference, and 23 sent low representatives. Not to mention the European delegation leaving the hall when Ahmadinejad addressed the conference. Now, you can ask me why, and we'll answer that, because it's a very interesting point later. Or perhaps if you have any question on this issue. Why such a position? Actually, all the disputed points, such as reference to Israel, Zionism, were deleted. And it is correct, they were deleted. Now, regarding the resolution adopted by the UN Commission, on human rights. Between 2006 and 2010, there were 27 such resolutions. 10 in 2006-7, 9 in 2007-8, 7 afterwards, and 1 2009-2010. All they address 4 issues: human rights in Palestine, human rights in Lebanon, human rights on the Golan, and a general declaration regarding the mandate of the Commission itself. In other words, they focused exclusively on the Arab-Israeli conflict and were always sponsored by the Arab Muslim group, which represent more than 40% of the UN members. 40%, it's a lot. Now, I want to raise 2 conclusions from all that. First of all, not surprisingly, there are still attempts by the enemy of Israel, mostly Arab and Muslim countries, to use the UN to bash Israel and to undermine its legitimacy. But this is becoming more and more difficult for them. And it is actually largely confined, not exclusively, but largely confined to the sphere of the Commission on Human Rights. Now, the bulk of the effort to undermine Israel's legitimacy does not come presently from the UN, but first and foremost from a coalition of NGOs which are functioning as the spearhead of a network looking to undermine the legitimacy of Jewish state. This development has recently been analyzed by the Resurgence Institute in its report, The Challenge of the Legislation. It provides a preliminary analysis of this network, its components, differentiating between those criticizing genuine Israel policies and it's a word that they have coined, the delegitimators, who are looking exclusively to undermine Israel's legitimacy and to bring an end to the Jewish state. The latter, the delegitimators, are used in pressing the Palestinian issue to achieve their aim, but they are not depending on it. And even a settlement, according to this report of the Resurgence Institute, and even a settlement of the conflict will not put an end to their endeavor. The report contends that, I quote, it takes a network to fight a network, and indicates ways to create it and to operate it. The Resurgence Institute has rightly attracted our attention to what seems to be today the more active factor in the endeavor to undermine Israel's legitimacy and to bring about Israel's demise. We should indeed remember one of the lessons of the ZR resolution, namely, not paying attention to a threat because an apparent more serious threat, at the time it was Israel expulsion from the UN, had just been foiled. And then, in the word of Moynihan, in a conference that we convened in Jerusalem, where he attended with the president at this time, Herzog, president, I quote, "The planes flew in under the radars. You're not paying attention, then you have another threat coming in. It is indeed vital not to disregard and underestimate threats. I am not sure that the real operative conclusion that it takes a network to fight a network is a supreme answer and the alpha and omega for the challenge of delegitimatization. There is also still much room for exploiting successes. We are not exploiting our successes and our achievement, notably in the UN, and using them to bolster Israel's legitimacy and to undermine the legitimacy of the delegitimators. In this spirit, Israel and Jewish people should use all the existing means at their disposal, such as the UN revocation of 379. We are not using it. We never use it. We did not mention that. I asked my research team at the Impact SE to find out if this was mentioned in Israeli school books. It was not mentioned. It's not mentioned. The revocation is not mentioned in Israeli school. One of my colleagues will refer to, there is a mention in one of the Palestinian school books, but I leave it for the question. In any case, we should use all the means at our disposal. And not only the UN revocation of the 379, the 1994 instruction to the special rapporteur, namely, that provide the facts regarding anti-Semitism all over the world. In this respect, there was an attempt made by Eliakim Rubinstein. At the time he was Field General of the government, and he sent a short report on that, but actually it was, it did not give concrete result, but it was an attempt to do something. We should, in my opinion, have go on using this avenue. In addition to that, we have the 2005 UN Holocaust Education Program. We have also the 2005 UN Annual Holocaust Remembrance Day. And in this respect, I want to give you an example of how it's possible to use a UN, how it was possible to use the UN Remembrance Day for of the Holocaust Day. MP Louise Ellman. Okay, she's here. Perhaps you can comment. You can come, please. I call my colleague David Oman, in charge of communication in the Director of Communication at the Impact SC.
About the messages.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Yohanan. I'll give you a brief example, a prime example of what Yohanan just mentioned, namely using the instruments or the instances available to combat anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of the State of Israel. Last November 2009, my colleague Ido Mizrahi, who's sitting there in the audience, and I met with two Labour MPs in London prior to our presentation at the House of Commons, and we presented to her our report on the Hamas web magazine for children, Al-Fatah. Now, MP Ellman took it to heart. She really took it to heart, and since this meeting, she has been questioning and pushing and even heckling Prime Minister Gordon Brown, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, to see what they can do to block access to this vile site in the UK. This is a site that is accessed by Muslim children in the United Kingdom. Now, in this instance, at a special debate on January 28th to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, she used this occasion and her speech at the podium to ask once more, what is Britain doing to stop not only well-known forms of nationalist anti-Semitism, but jihadi anti-Semitism and the delegitimization of the State of Israel emanating from such sites as Al-Fatah. And she quoted from our report. I'm going to play a short clip of her speech.
Of hate that emanate from various sources, including the internet. We are familiar with the messages of anti-Semitic hate that come from organisations like the BNP. We are all aware of that and are ready, rightly, to condemn what they are doing. But always ready to condemn the anti-Semitic messages of hate that come from Islamist jihadist sources. And they are around our society. They are on our university campuses, they are on the internet. And are we willing to condemn internet sites like Hamas's Al-Fatah website, preaching to British children at this moment? Messages such as the column they have in it entitled Stories of Uncle Is al-Din, talking about the Jews, and they depicting Jews, and I quote, as if they are wolves whose eyes blaze with evil. Evil fills their hearts. They are indeed the murderers of the prophets. And should we allow such a website with its cartoon-headed criminal Jews depicting a person, half Israeli soldier, with brandishing a gun with teeth barred, and half stereotype the Aspera Jew with the big nose grasping for money and the skull cap? Is it right that at this time, as we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day, that such an internet site is able to broadcast to young children in this country and indeed elsewhere around the world with its messages of hate? I'm told, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by the Home Office that they are considering whether there are grounds to stop this website on a voluntary basis. I think they should make their minds up quickly, because if we are serious about stopping the messages of hate, we must not think only about the BNP, we have to look at Islamist, jihadist sources of hate as well, and this website is one of them.
Well, in conclusion, I think that we should also think of not only using what is at the discourse, but using our position in the UN and our allies in the UN together to bring about new resolutions, notably to condemn anti-Semitism, which is not yet been condemned by the General Assembly, and to develop new instruments, educational instruments, political instruments, in order to strengthen our legitimacy and to repel all the attempts that are developed all over the world, mainly by many NGOs, to demise the Jewish state. Thank you.
Rabbi Porat, Dr. Avner Falk, Kaplan. So,
Johan, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. What would you say is the role of Israeli and Jewish spokespeople in what you described? We hear about it in other elements, but I'd be curious what you've come across in terms of the role of the Israelis and Jews as our own worst enemies, as being on the attack against the legitimacy of the Jewish state. What have you come across in your research?
We have 3 questions only, so
well, it's difficult to say. I don't want to generalize. Sometimes it's coming from a genuine I should say it was genuine motive. I think that the argument use the counterproductive argument that I mentioned, the Foreign Office, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Israel, regarding not to table a resolution to repeal, fearing that this will entail reiteration. There was some ground on that. It cannot be dismissed completely. But actually, there was also some people, not only in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Israeli society, that they thought that it would not be dignified to fight to justify Zionism. There are many, and this attitude of disdain that I just referred to. So I should not say that Israel is that in Israel there are several citizens or institutions or parties that they act as our enemies acting. No, but they were not believing that, taking into account again I mentioned the so-called automatic majority at the UN, that they were cautious. They did not want to fight back. So this is a more general attitude that not to make wave and to think that it will actually it will go on and without fighting. So I cannot confirm your feeling. There are people with conviction. There are anti-Zionists also, including Israel. There are not many, they exist. Of course, there are perhaps a large number outside, within the Jewish people. Also Jews that are against Zionism, are not accepting. But this is really marginal.
This is marginal in Israel, it is also marginal in the Jewish people. It was different in the 30s. Far different. So we should not exaggerate. It exists, but it's possible, and since I several times trace the automatic majority, so-called, I want to explain why I respond. Once, in one of the conferences, we invited the Under-Secretary, Secretary General of the UN, James Jonah. He was from Sierra Leone. And it was in one of the conferences was in Paris, at the Senate in Paris. In the conference we organized in order to delegitimize the ZR. And he gave a very interesting speech. By the way, the Israeli embassy was opposed, was completely opposed that he will appear there. And he explained that many countries of the third world are looking for leadership. So when there is a leadership, when there is a force, they are supporting it. At this time, there were no Western leadership, no US leadership, no Israel, US Western leadership to propose something else. This is very interesting. And he said it's not correct, he said, that there is such an automatic majority. And the proof of it is that it was possible to prevent reiteration in spite of this so-called automatic majority. You have to fight. You have to find ways. You have to convince. You have to propose something. So it's not really an answer to your question, but it is my opinion.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture from which I really learned quite a bit. I want to mention there's a psychological question as to whether the people who drafted the Zionism as racism resolutions, whether they really believed that Zionism was a form of racism. I don't think it's self-evident. I can give you an example. You know, in psychoanalysis, already Sigmund Freud mentioned that when something is missing from a statement or from whatever, a dream or whatever, it is perhaps no less important than if something is there. And the example is the first document, I think, that you presented, which was from Mexico in 1975. And the people who drafted that resolution were so eager to say that Zionism was racism that they forgot to put in imperialism in that statement. I noticed that they put colonialism, they put neo-colonialism, but they forgot imperialism, which is almost in every other resolution. So that begs the question, of course, whether they were so eager to prove that Zionism was racism, whether they actually believed that Zionism was racism. Thank you.
I think that you are absolutely correct. The question is very interesting, what you are raising. I am sure that the tools to answer it properly. But I want to recall, to remember you, that the initiative for this resolution came from the Soviet Union. And several years before that, there was a huge campaign against anti-Semitism, against Zionism in the Soviet Union, in order to fight back the international pressure to free the Jews from the USSR. It was, I think, 1 year there was perhaps 25 books not in thousands, in millions of copies in the USSR against Zionism. And so, did they believe in it? I don't know. I think that sometimes you are taking a position, then you are starting to believe in it. In any case, it was a campaign, a huge campaign. Of course, the reason for this campaign was to try to fight back the international pressure to liberate, to free the Jews. So, but in addition to that, there was some element deep in ground in Russian and even in Soviet Union regarding the Jews, regarding Zionism. So, of course, the political considerations were absolutely decisive. But I am sure that behind that there were also other positions, although Moynihan, when we spoke with him, when we invited him the conference of the President and Herzog residence where we had this international conference, he told us that it's not clear what was the reason for this, Soviet move. And it was not, for the time being, perhaps now it's interesting because there is access to the archives. It was very interesting to understand what exactly was behind it. I suppose that what I mentioned is one of the factors, but actually I don't know of any research that was done in this respect.
I wondered if you were aware for probably 20 years there has been a major committee of Hadassah in America called Curriculum Watch, which does work to combat things such as, and they actually scan textbooks, American textbooks, with keywords like Zionism, Israel, racism, etc., and then have meetings with the publishers, chapter and verse, showing them where things should be changed. So there is something being done on the other, from that sense. I wanted to know if you were aware of this.
I must confess that I was not. I wasn't. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to give you this information.
On the contrary, I think that we if it's going on, we will be very ready. Our institute, we are special on this, and of course to cooperate with them. It's a very important initiative. Undoubtedly.
My question is, do you think there was any significance that the Zionism is Racism resolution was passed at a UN Women's Conference? And what do you think the role of women's NGOs, which there are many of, can do to continue to combat the delegitimization?
I think it was the first opportunity, international opportunity, for the Soviet Arab Muslim Alliance to work, to put, although, as I mentioned, 2 months before, in Kampala and in Lima, there were already resolutions in the same spirit. So it was, but the fact that it was in conference that had no direct connection at all with the conflict, and they find a way to introduce it. This was very clever, and it was and it was surprising that it worked. It worked, and of course here the pressure that were exerted later, for instance, Nairobi, were not exerted at this time. So there was a maneuver that surprised the West, surprised the United States, surprised Israel, and at the beginning the reaction was to try to ignore or to say, okay, they are crazy. So I think there was something that it had been placed there. It was a success, and what was surprising, it was not connected at all with the Middle East conflict. So it was a very general conference on women's rights, on their contribution to peace, to development, to equality. It was really a blow. So this is why you have to be very, very vigilant. And we were not vigilant, and we were surprised. We didn't know how to react. So I think, I am not sure it was carefully planned, but they used an opportunity and they succeed. And so from this point of view, I think that afterwards, in Copenhagen, at the 5 years afterwards, it was again reiterated very strongly. So it was, and it was probably very effective the coalition was working. They were gaining votes. Even it was rated with a higher. I think in Copenhagen only the United States and Israel opposed it, and they did not went out of the conference. It changed afterwards. So I think the remark is now regarding the contribution, the possible contribution of the women to against this the ZR equation. Of course, undoubtedly. But again, we did not form the proper coalition. We saw it as a Jewish issue or an Israeli issue. But it's a more general issue. And if not, you have to turn it into a more general issue. And this is how we are, I think that here and there we are understanding that, we are making coalition with non-Jewish bodies that are really concerned for the rights of the women, for their development, for the equality of rights between women and men. So I think that we have to use opportunities and to see the world in general. Not only that we are under attack and we are the only problem in the world. Not. And then we can make very good coalition. There are many NGOs and many countries that are really wanting the UN to work and to make progress on the several issues that, notably on this issue of the women's rights. So I think that, and by the way, I just mentioned Mr. Elena Morton. 3 days after the passing of this resolution, she had this statement that there was already a committee of women from all over the world that are organizing themselves in order to repeal. It was the only reaction in this direction from a woman, and having with her the coalition or the support of other women. So, yes, I think you are correct.
May I just add one more thing? Having been on the commission, the Israeli delegation to the UN Commission on Women's Rights, the Israeli government and the Israeli Foreign Ministry does not take this issue seriously. And our delegation never was properly prepared, and I think that that's really what happened.
Dr. Nelly last and then Noga Porat.
I just want to say one thing. I'm sorry.
Today, national identity and also identity is considered as a racism, you see in France. And I think Zionism is not is a national identity. You have a problem. The ideology of in France today, you know about the debate in France. National identity is a racism. It's considered as a racism in many places.
Well, yesterday I was asked on TV exactly on that. I say that for every nation there is a problem of ongoing defining its identity. Okay, it's a legitimate debate. And we have to take part, we have to understand that the questioning of national legitimacy is part of how you are defining your identity, national identity. And it's part, if it remains within the borders of this legitimate discussion, okay, why not? But in the case of Israel, it does not remain within the borders of this legitimate discourse or debate. And this is a problem. And if we attack this in this sense, we could get a large support for most of the countries saying we're also part of the debate. It's not on the only debate. But of course, it does not mean that you are, as you say, the problem is not Israel's right to exist. The identity, it's a problem. National identity, what it will be, how it will evolve. Okay, it's a legitimate question. But the problem here was the existing actually attacking the right of Israel to exist. Actually, it was singling out Israel for this. So if we think we should accept the debate, but we should also point to what is not acceptable. And I think that if we do that, we could get the support of many, many countries, of many, many NGOs. Many are serious, not all of them. So, but this should be the approach. And of course, we should prepare our delegation in this spirit. And prepare that ahead. Not the last week or 2 weeks and then. To have a coalition, you have to invest a lot of work. You have to support them on other issues.
Last question.
I just wanted to say something about the involvement of NGOs. I'm the new executive director of Impact SE. In my last role, I was the executive director of Amnesty International in Israel. So I have a long history of NGO work. And I think that, Yohanan, listening to you this morning, I was thinking that just like in any other area that we see today in the Israeli society, the place of NGOs has to be much more effective and maybe louder in terms of our definition as a society who we are. I think the question that was in my head all the time was, what is Zionism? I mean, for me, Zionism is probably different than what it was for my parents who built the kibbutz in the Negev. And I think this debate should be led by the NGOs, including all sides of Israeli society today, so we can have this dialogue with the world as well. Because I think when people refer to Zionism, first of all, everybody has probably a different image. Secondly, I think that we didn't take the right. As you said, we have to take the right. We have to fight, we have to change things, we have to be proactive. I think the same thing is with Zionism. I think that not all parts of the Israeli society are equal parts because of their own fault, I think. In this debate, what is Zionism today? We have a huge platform that is the internet today, that we have to learn how to use in order to build a dialogue with the world. And us as NGOs, we have to learn how to approach instances as the UN and other instances in order to open a public debate and not leave this only to politicians. And the last word is that I believe that women's role in this is very crucial. I think women have pushed things forward in the world in terms of advancing the world more than any other sector, because nobody was going to do it for them. So I personally always try to push women to do more in that sense and lead the public debate.
Well, this is not exactly falling within the frame of my my address, my lecture today, but it's an interesting issue. I think that also how Jews and Israeli behave in international fora, in international scene, this is also it can be a strong Zionist message. Sometimes you don't have to explain what is Zionist, but you have to behave as a Zionist. And behaving as a Zionist is, by the way, in one of the conferences we invited Regis Debray. Regis Debray, that we know him, he was a colleague of Che Guevara. And he was freed due to also the intervention or the involvement of the Israeli ambassador in Venezuela. And after that, he became he's a very well-known writer, but he was also involved in politics. He was one of the main advisors of President Mitterrand. And we invited him at one of the conferences. And he gave a huge lecture, not lecture. Yes, it was actually a lecture. It was actually a paper because he could not come, so he wrote it. he was to attend the Prime Minister visit in East Germany at this time. In any case, he wrote a wonderful piece about Zionism. About what is Zionism and what is the distinction between a nationalist and a patriot. And he said exactly about Zionism. So what I wanted to say is it's many things came out of, you don't have to, sometimes you can create conditions that others are doing the work for you. And it's not so difficult. It's far better than when we say what Zionism is about. It's far more effective. In any case, it's there. You can find it in the book. I don't remember where it is. Now, just last remark. I want to ask my colleague Ido Mizrahi, who is in charge of research in our institute, because he had a remark. He asked me, do you know if the Palestinians are mentioning the repeal of the 3379 in their school books? I did not remember, but since he's doing the research, please, can you update us about that? Are they referring or not to the repeal? By contrast with the Israeli school books that are even not mentioning it.
First of all, thank you. I'm not so ready, but I hope it will be okay. Here I'm holding the book, History of the Arab and the Muslim. It's from 2009, and it's studied right now at the Palestinian Authority. And yes, it mentions there about 2 paragraphs telling the story about ZR and Resolution 3379. Also, something interesting, maybe Yohanan can elaborate more about what they read writing here, but I want to say that at the end of this book there is a question: when Resolution ZR 3379 actually started, and maybe we can learn about the Palestinian, how they educate their pupils and the children with this kind of a question, not when the journey of abolish this resolution ended, but when it started. And that's it, I think.
But what is the reason? How do they explain that it was repealed? What are the arguments?
The argument is because of I think the Madrid conference and the starting of the Middle East peace process and conversation. The U.S. forced to demolish and revoke the resolution 3379.
So you can see the difference with my explanation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to Dr. Manor. Good to see you with Yohanan.